You are alive right now because of decisions you will never read about in any history book. Decisions made in the dark, in bunkers, on submarines, in silence. Between 1961 and 1983, the world ended in its own mind at least 5 separate times. 5 times, the machinery of nuclear war began moving. 5 times, something impossibly small pulled it back. A gut feeling, a dollar switch, 1 vote, a war game, a clock that didn't match. 5 moments, 5 human beings, 8 billion lives. This is not a collection of close calls. This is the complete story of how close we actually came, and why most people will never know how thin the margin was. This is 26 seconds from World War III. September 26, 1983. A Soviet nuclear early warning bunker outside Moscow. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is sitting at his post. His job is simple. If the system reports incoming American missiles, he picks up the phone and tells his superiors. They launch. The Americans launch back. Everyone dies. At 12 minutes past midnight, the alarm screams. 1 American missile detected, inbound. Petrov looks at the screen. He looks at his protocol. Protocol says, report it. He doesn't, because something felt wrong. A first strike with 1 missile? America had thousands. Why send 1? Then the system updates. 2 missiles, 3, 4, 5. Petrov sits with his hand over the phone for what must have felt like a lifetime. He decides the system is malfunctioning. He reports a false alarm. He was right. A Soviet satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for American missile launches. Petrov wasn't celebrated. He wasn't given a medal. He was quietly reprimanded for improper record keeping and retired early. 1 man, 1 decision. 8 billion people who never knew his name are alive because of it. This is what standing between humanity and extinction looks like. Not a general, not a president, a lieutenant colonel on a night shift who trusted his gut over his orders. And the world survived. But Petrov wasn't the first. 22 years earlier, before the Soviet early warning systems, before the bunkers, before any of the Cold War infrastructure designed to prevent nuclear war, the United States nearly destroyed itself. Not by Soviet action, not by war, by accident, over North Carolina on a Tuesday morning. January 23, 1961. A United States Air Force B-52 Stratofortress breaks apart mid-flight over Goldsboro, North Carolina. It was carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, each one 250 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Both fell to earth. The first bomb deployed its parachute and landed relatively intact in a field. The second bomb did not deploy its parachute. It hit the ground at terminal velocity and buried itself 20 feet into a North Carolina swamp. When investigators reached it, they found it had gone through 3 of its 4 arming sequences. 3 out of 4. 1 switch stood between a 250 kiloton nuclear detonation and the eastern seaboard of the United States. A low voltage switch, the kind that costs less than $1. It was set to ARM. A later investigation found that switch was so unreliable, it had previously been known to close on its own. The United States nearly nuked itself, not by enemy action, not by war, by a broken B-52. The full wreckage was never recovered. Parts of that bomb are still in the ground in North Carolina to this day. A dollar switch. That's what stood between the eastern seaboard and a 250 kiloton detonation. But mechanical failure is at least predictable, at least understandable. What happens when the decision to end the world isn't made by a faulty switch, but by three men trapped underwater who believe the war has already started? The Cuban Missile Crisis, 300 feet below the Caribbean. October 27th, 1962, the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Somewhere in the Caribbean, 300 feet below the surface, a Soviet B-59 submarine is dying. The U.S. Navy has been depth charging it for hours, not to destroy it, to force it to surface. They didn't know what was inside. The submarine was carrying a nuclear torpedo, one single nuclear torpedo, yield comparable to the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Inside that hull, the temperature had reached 140 degrees. CO2 levels were rising. Men were passing out at their stations, and they had been completely cut off from Moscow for 3 days. They had no idea if the war had already started. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, had enough. He looked at his crew. He looked at the depth charges still exploding around them. He made a decision. We will launch now. Under Soviet protocol, a nuclear launch required agreement from 3 officers. The captain, the political officer, both voted yes. 2 out of 3. The third officer was Vasili Arkhipov, second in command of the entire submarine flotilla, the only man on that vessel whose rank gave his vote equal weight to the captain's. He said no. In a metal tube, 300 feet underwater, 140 degrees, explosions shaking the hull, his captain screaming at him. He said no. The submarine surfaced. No torpedo was launched. The crisis eventually de-escalated. Arkhipov was never celebrated. The incident was classified for decades. He died in 1998, and most of the world still doesn't know his name. 2 men said yes. 1 man said no. You are here because of that 1 man. The margin between civilization and nuclear war was 1 man's conscience. That was 1962. 21 years later, the world came that close again. But this time, there was no single officer, no single decision, no single moment of human clarity. This time, an entire military apparatus concluded that nuclear war had already begun. Because of a training exercise, NATO's Able Archer 83. November 1983, NATO launches a military exercise called Able Archer 83. On paper, a routine simulation of nuclear war procedures. In reality, it was the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War that nobody has ever heard of. The exercise was frighteningly realistic. NATO forces practiced the full sequence from conventional warfare all the way through to nuclear release. New communication protocols, new code words, even the voices of real heads of state were used in the transmissions. The Soviets were listening to every word, and they believed it was real. Soviet intelligence had spent years warning the Kremlin that America was planning a nuclear first strike. They called it Operation Rhine, and Able Archer looked exactly like the opening move. Soviet nuclear forces went to their highest alert level. In East Germany, Soviet fighter jets were armed with nuclear weapons and placed on runway standby. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles were brought to combat readiness. They were minutes from launching a preemptive strike. What stopped them? A KGB double agent named Oleg Gordievsky passed intelligence to British MI6, who immediately warned Washington that the Soviets genuinely believed the exercise was a cover for a real attack. NATO quietly wound down Able Archer. The Soviets stood down. The world never knew how close it got. Ronald Reagan was reportedly so shaken when he learned how the Soviets had interpreted the exercise, it directly changed his approach to nuclear diplomacy for the rest of his presidency. A war game, that almost became a real war, stopped by one man passing a note to the right people at the right time. Able Archer ended in November 1983. The year wasn't finished. The same broken satellite, the same early warning system, a different officer, a different shift. And this time, he followed protocol. For 17 minutes, the Soviet Union believed it was under full nuclear attack. In 1983, the world ended in its own mind, not once, twice. You already know about Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer who refused to report 5 incoming missiles in September 1983. What you don't know is that 1983 almost ended the world a second time. In the same year, with the same system, with a different officer and a different outcome. The Soviet early warning satellite network, the same one Petrov was monitoring, had a fundamental design flaw. Under certain atmospheric conditions, sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds could be mistaken for a missile launch. Engineers knew about this flaw. They reported it. Nothing was fixed. On September 26th, the same night Petrov made his decision, the system triggered again. Different shift, different officer. The alarm reported not 5 missiles, but a full-scale launch, dozens of incoming warheads. This officer followed protocol. He reported it up the chain. Soviet military command went to combat readiness. For 17 minutes, the Soviet Union believed it was under nuclear attack. What saved the world this time wasn't one man's gut feeling. It was the delay in the system. The warheads hadn't arrived when the timeline said they should. The math didn't add up. Command stood down. The same year, the same broken satellite, 2 separate false alarms. One stopped by instinct, one stopped by arithmetic. 5 moments between 1961 and 1983. None of these were designed to save the world. None of these were protocols. None of these were systems. They were accidents of humanity. Moments where one person did something the machine around them didn't expect. The margin wasn't wide. It was a gut feeling, $1, 1 vote, 1 spy, 1 clock. That's all that stands between the world you live in and the world that almost was. Remember their names: Stanislav Petrov, the Goldsboro crew, Vasili Arkhipov, Oleg Gordievsky, and the officer whose name we still don't know. This has been 26 Seconds from World War III. Thank you for watching the full story. One person, a phone, an unreasonable amount of research into things governments would probably prefer you didn't know about. Subscribe. It's free and it genuinely makes a difference. Tuesday.